Desert Storm, or Iraq War I, 1990-91, short war seen as a brief war that accomplished the objective of removing Iraq from neighboring Kuwait and presided over by then President George H.W. Bush. But what does this have to do with Afghanistan, 9/11, the war on terror in general? Well, the 1990s are this period of heightened tension in the Middle East, though even decades before, there's still plenty of U.S. intervention in the Middle East. But let me talk about how this situation developed and brought about some of the conditions that would be present by the 2000s, by 9/11, and then beyond. So Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait in the summer of 1990. There was a dispute over a couple different issues, one of which was Saddam Hussein believed that since he had and Iraq had been engaged in this bloody war, which the U.S. supported him in against Iran, that the next that Kuwait had benefited from this, and that Kuwait should pay some of the war costs and be involved in supporting Iraq. They also had limited oil output during that war, the Iran-Iraq war, and so Saddam Hussein wanted some payment, some reciprocity from Kuwait. Other issues going on there as well, deal with drilling and all sorts of different things. But either way, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in 1990, and the U.S. launched a war to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, which it did successfully. George H.W. Bush said after this, "It's a proud day for America. By God, we've kicked Vietnam syndrome once and for all." In other words, we were able to operate this quick victory. It's the end of the Cold War. It's kind of a shifting where the Soviet Union is going to collapse and the international order is going to enter a more unipolar system where there's only one great power, being the United States, as opposed to a bipolar system with the Soviet Union and the United States competing for international. And so this was a unique moment. It's viewed as a success for George H.W. Bush. His approval rating is very high after this. I believe it's somewhere in the 90%, can easily be looked up online. But there's some aftermath and continued intervention into the 1990s, and that's what gets to the war on terror and the Afghanistan war. After the success of driving out Iraq from Kuwait, U.S. forces did not leave. Then President George H.W. Bush encouraged Shiite Arab Iraqis and Kurdish Iraqis to overthrow the Sunni Arab-backed Iraqi dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. Now, it may sound a little bit confusing with if you're not familiar with the region, the Shiite, the Kurds, and the Sunnis, but these are ethnic and cultural divisions that the Iraqis have between them. So, like it or not, they are part of the situation there, and we have to deal with them. But long story short, George H.W. Bush is encouraging many of the Iraqis after they've left. Well, I mean, not left really, but they're still in these surrounding bases and different things and staging after Desert Storm. But he's now encouraging the Iraqis to work to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein. And he did this on February 15th, 1991. He did it in a speech on a radio program called Voice of America. And this statement that he made a couple different times was broadcast on international television, radio, and even leaflets dropped to Iraqi soldiers and civilians, encouraging them to resist, have a revolution, and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And over here at the bottom right of my screen is one of the leaflets, a picture of the leaflets dropped to try to convince the people to overthrow the Saddam regime. And this is an encouragement towards further intervention, which the U.S. was at this time was still fighting briefly in Desert Storm, and it was soon to come to an end. Here's a quote from George H.W. Bush. He said, "But there's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside." Now, Bush would later say that that's not what he meant, that that's not what he said, but this is what he said, and this was broadcast purposefully and leaflets dropped purposefully to get this type of result. Two videos that you can look into on this. You can look on my YouTube channel. There's a playlist with these lined up together. It's a video from a journalist named Barry Lando. It's a series of short videos based really on his work, and he has a book also by this title called Web of Deceit, which is the history of American complicity in Iraq from really since post or maybe even during World War II to the present day. So he has these two videos talking about the situation that happened next. Here's another quote from George H.W. Bush: "Fill the streets and alleys and bring down Saddam and his aides." So again, he is encouraging the Iraqi people to overthrow their own government. This led to many Iraqis believing that the United States would support them and help them if they decided to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. February 28th, 1991, however, there's a ceasefire. Bush declares a ceasefire in these conflicts and is negotiating a ceasefire with Iraqi generals and Saddam Hussein. So this is a little bit over 2 weeks after he made the first initial statement. And so on the next day, though, on March 1st, Iraq does explode into a rebellion. It does explode into a civil war. And the U.S. did not back the rebellion. So the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, was compelling the Iraqi people to overthrow the government because they saw this as whatever means they could use to put the hurt on Saddam while they were fighting him to get him to withdraw from Kuwait and to force him to the negotiating table. And eventually they get that ceasefire. Then after that, the thing does erupt in rebellion. And the U.S. backs totally out of it. And now they say, we're not going to intervene. After Iraq's surrender to the U.S., Hussein was allowed by the U.S. to keep his attack helicopters. Then he used those very attack helicopters that the U.S. government allowed him to keep to kill everybody who was rising up against him that the U.S. had, after the U.S. had told them to do that. And the U.S. eventually even intervened on Saddam's side to stop the rebellions against him by landing attack helicopters on a highway to Baghdad to block the Iraqi army division that was on its way to the capital to remove Saddam Hussein. And so the Iraqi people felt betrayed. Bush had encouraged this rebellion and then let it happen and let all these people die. And why did they do this? What was the strategy behind this? Well, I mentioned the first part of the strategy was to use whatever means possible to get the result of what they wanted with Saddam Hussein. But uh, oh, and here's some of the numbers before I get to the why. Saddam Hussein's regime then used helicopters, long-range artillery, and armored ground forces to kill 30 to 60,000 Shias in the south and some 20,000 Kurds in the north. It was a brutal slaughter at that point. And so the U.S. And the Bush administration had encouraged the uprisings, but after the ceasefire and surrender, the Bush administration did not back up the uprisings that it encouraged. The Bush administration feared the Iranian-backed Shia. So here's the problem. Iran was backing Shia Iraqis in the fight against Saddam. So the fear now was if they remove Saddam, they may get replaced by someone who is more friendly to Iran, and Iran may have more power in Iraq. Goes to show one of the issues of the unintended consequences of intervention. So they couldn't have that, and so the US government gave away from the recent conflict that they had just engaged in, Iraqi weapons and munitions. They didn't give them to the Iraqis. They didn't destroy them. They actually gave them to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen are the Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan that are going to be a problem later, and we'll see that as well. And so this slaughter takes place. Why did the Bush administration support the Iraqi rebellion? It encouraged, or not support the Iraqi rebellion it had encouraged against Saddam Hussein. Why the seeming flip? And here's why. I already mentioned about Iran, but during the Reagan era, there was efforts to contain the 1979 Shiite revolution in Iraq. So if you want to see my video on Iran rather than Iraq, the 1979 Shiite revolution in Iran, you can check that out on my channel. But the Reagan era efforts to contain Iran after that uprising, in order to do that, they backed Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. So then to remove him at a later point would, in their minds, unleash Iran. Iranian-backed militias were present among the Iraqi resistance to Saddam. President Bush's hope was to remove Saddam, but to keep his Ba'athist regime intact. Bush fomented a rebellion among the Iraqis against Saddam Hussein and then reversed policy and betrayed the uprising. Okay, so this conflict took place and set the precedent for what was going to be going on in Iraq during the 1990s, which become this key period for the development of what's coming with Afghanistan and the war on terror and suicide terrorism led by Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So what does this have to do with the Afghanistan war? Well, its further military occupation of the region led to resentment. This was already part of the issue, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, that the greatest predictor of suicide terror is foreign occupation of a region. Osama bin Laden planned to remove Saddam, but the Saudi king and leaders told him to let the Americans do it. The eventual removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq War II, by the way, was a great boon to AQI, that's Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Saddam being moved out of the way was a great boon to them because it helped them by removing this leader who was actually against them, and they were against him, and allowed them to gain power in that region and to gain things like ISIS and ISIL. Osama bin Laden resented American occupation and pro-Western regimes propped up by the West, and then the bombing and sanctions of Iraq, which killed hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people and civilians, was used by Osama bin Laden to declare jihad against the United States. Let me go on and talk a little bit more about bin Laden's radicalization in the 1990s as a result of Desert Storm. Stephen Colin, Ghost Wars, about the history of the CIA, Afghanistan, and bin Laden from the Soviet invasion until September 10th, 2001, writes, by autumn of 1990, bin Laden was agitated too about the threat facing Saudi Arabia from Iraqi forces that had invaded and occupied Kuwait in August. Bin Laden wanted to lead a jihad against the Iraqis. Bin Laden objected violently to the decision of the Saudi royal family to invite American troops to defend the kingdom. So here's what Osama bin Laden is saying. He is in Saudi Arabia during this time, and he is very concerned with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Not because of the Kuwaitis, but because Kuwait is right on the border of both Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And to him, Saudi Arabia, as I'll mention, is Muslim Holy Land, and he's afraid that Saddam Hussein is going to attempt to invade Saudi Arabia. So he wants to round up his military men and fight a jihad against Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis. But this proposal is rejected by the Saudis, who want to instead invite in the Americans to do it. And this makes Osama bin Laden very upset, very disillusioned with the Saudi regime, and further radicalizes him to continue on his path to suicide terror and international terrorism. So after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, they were resisted by the local Islamic Mujahideen. We talked about this. Osama bin Laden headed to Afghanistan to fight at 25 years old. It's here that bin Laden came for the first time face to face with US military advisors who were training and arming the Mujahideen. In 1989, the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan, and the US government began to fear blowback. I'll have another video on the whole topic of blowback itself. The CIA planned to assassinate bin Laden, but he found out about it and was able to avoid assassination. After the US had come in and fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviets, bin Laden felt, and bin Laden and the CIA had tried to assassinate him. Bin Laden felt that the Mujahideen had been used, had been exploited. He felt that he was mistreated as well, and he began to resent Saudi Arabia for being so compliant with the American regime, but he also began to resent the United States, who had used Afghanistan and the Mujahideen to accomplish their larger goals of fighting the Soviets. So during the 1990 invasion, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait from Iraq, bin Laden feared an Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia. And here's a quote from bin Laden himself. He says, I want to fight against Saddam, an infidel. I want to establish a guerrilla war against Iraq. And you can see here on my little picture of this map, here's Iraq, here's little Kuwait, and here's Saudi Arabia. So when Iraq, through Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, bin Laden is concerned about the integrity of Saudi Arabia. So he says, I want to fight Saddam, and he's an infidel. I want to establish a jihad against Iraq, a guerrilla war against Iraq. The Saudis instead rejected his plan and wanted to invite in the US to drive out Iraq. Soon, 100,000 US troops arrived in Saudi Arabia. Now, so what? But remember what I said about foreign occupation. Bin Laden was offended because Saudi Arabia is considered Muslim Holy Land, and according to the Quran and his reading of it, non-Muslims are forbidden in Saudi Arabia. And he brought this up, but they said, well, they can be here to help us, they can be here to fight. And so to him, this was a breach in integrity of his fellow Muslims. This was a compromise of morals. And so he became very disillusioned with the Saudi Arabian regime and further resented the foreign occupation and the increasing military presence in the Middle East from the United States. And he would gain sympathy with other Muslims in that region, not for necessarily the actions that he took, but for his intention behind it to drive the American presence out of Muslim lands, especially Saudi Arabia. It was in December of 1991 that bin Laden began orchestrating attacks first against Saudi-based U.S. targets. So those bases within Saudi Arabia were some of his first targets of terrorism. Later on, as a consequence, and I'll end the video here, after the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration, second Bush administration, George W. Bush, misled the American public, claiming they had solid evidence that Saddam Hussein was closely allied with Osama bin Laden. This falsely implied that Saddam Hussein bore some responsibility for the 9/11 attacks and was part of the gaining the support for Iraq War II, which happened in 2003. But this is important knowledge that Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein were not friends. They were not allies. And this is kind of the not all bad guys are the same. They're both bad guys. They're both evil, brutal, demonic men. But that doesn't mean that they're friends with each other. And that doesn't mean that they're complicit with each other. Remember the quote that I showed in the earlier slide. Osama bin Laden wanted to fight a war, a holy war, against Iraq and against Saddam Hussein, calling him an infidel. So the misinformation campaign leading up to Iraq War II, that Saddam Hussein was really allied with Osama bin Laden, was a lie. But it was used as a tool to curry support for the war in Iraq. And the war in Afghanistan was going on at that point. But this just shows the development of Osama bin Laden in the 1990s and his further targeting of U.S. military forces because of that foreign occupation in the region, especially in Saudi Arabia.